subscribed, welcome back, my darling. And if you have not yet subscribed, please do subscribe and join a part of our family and our community that we're growing here on YouTube. And while you're down there hitting the subscribe button, because I have faith that you will, also turn your notification bell on for all notifications and become a part of the Morgan Shay Notify Gang. So, welcome to the next part of the beauty and documentary breakdown on the Night Stalker on Netflix. Before we even get started, and I do my little thing here at the beginning, I do want to go ahead and say viewer discretion is extremely advised. In this episode, in all beauty and documentary breakdowns, it's viewer discretion advised. But this one in particular is going to be very gruesome. We are going to be describing crime scenes. We are going to be getting into the nitty gritty. I also do not think, I know a lot of you guys like to watch my videos with your kids. I think that you should definitely watch this documentary before you make that decision, because again, this is very gruesome. There have even been news articles on just if this one went a little too far. So keep that in mind. Again, we are going to be talking about sensitive subject matter such as murder and rape. So if either one of these things are harmful, hurtful, triggering for you in any way, please click out of today's video. As always, there will be other content linked for you up in the cards. There's always other options on this channel. Again, viewer discretion is extremely advised. So you guys may not know this. Well, you probably don't know this because I've never shared this information. But what I like to do is I like to watch each episode before I film. So I literally watch whatever documentary we're talking about. I watch the episode right before I film. So it's all fresh in my brain. And while I may have a script as far as order, so basically topics and what order I want, just so that it does make sense, I've just watched it. So it's all really fresh on my mind. So today, while I was working in between calls, I was watching on my laptop the second episode. And I didn't like the way that it ended because it left on a really big cliffhanger. And I just didn't like the way that the episode was going to end here in the breakdown. So I have decided to include part 2 and part 3 together. And then next week we will do the final episode, episode 4, and my final thoughts on it then. So did just want to say that as well. So viewer discretion advised. Again, we're going to be breaking down episode 2 and 3. So if you have not watched those, please go watch those and then come back before we do the breakdown, because this is going to be full of spoilers. If you've never watched a breakdown before, we're basically breaking down the documentary, and the final episode is my thoughts. So let's go ahead and get into it. I have already cut my brows. I've already shaped my brows, all the things. On my brows, as always, is the Benefit Goof Proof Brow Pencil in shade 3.75. I then go in and cut my brows with the Kevin Kwan Pot Concealer, and I use a Laura Lee Los Angeles concealer brush. I then go in with the Gimme Brow in shade 3, and that is a tinted brow gel, and I put that in my brows. So we are picking up eyeshadow. Be sure that you have watched the first episode in this breakdown, because we're picking up right where we left off. So I will not be going over what we've already discussed. These videos are already super long. So again, episode 1, beauty and documentary breakdown of the Night Stalker, is in the cards now. So at the very beginning of episode 2, it's news clippings. There's these strangulations where the bodies are basically left on hillsides. They're nude, and there's no sign of a struggle. And Frank talks about how he gets called on one of these murders, and they're saying that it is a possible drug overdose. And he's like, no. In the words of Bailey Sarian, nay. It doesn't make sense, because there's no sign of a struggle. This just doesn't add up. 1 + 1 always equals 2, and this 1 + 1 is equal in 75 here. So he thinks and says in his mind, this is an officer or someone who is pretending to be an officer. So basically he says, you know, this has to be an officer or somebody who is pretending to be an officer. Come to find out, it was a security officer. It was him and his cousin. They were doing it together, and Frank solved that case. So basically in episode 2, right off the jump, they're letting you know, like, Frank was the shit. Frank was the business. They're wanting you to know just how big of a deal it was that Frank chose Gil to be his partner. This was a big deal. This was the homicide detective. Frank and Gil both, you know, are describing where you have to go mentally when you are on a manhunt like this. And unfortunate enough, you have to put yourself in that somehow. I don't know how they do it, but they have to put themselves in that headspace of where would I be? Because here's the thing, guys, and they're going to talk about this a lot more in episode 2. It's widely spoke about all throughout the episode about how there was no significant target. There was no specific gender. There was no specific race. There was no specific age. There was nothing. It was completely and totally random where he hit. It was random. It was all over the place. It was different economical backgrounds. It was different races. It was different ages. And we're talking about, in this episode, you'll find out, we're going all the way up into the upper 80s, okay? And he is sexually assaulting women in their upper 80s. Like, there is no, and this is when they really talk about how much of a panic LA was in, because everybody was petrified. Everybody was scared to death because there was no one specific target. Say, for instance, me, brown hair, you know, thicker, white, Caucasian girl. It wasn't like that. It did not matter. It did not matter. And what's also important to remember, guys, just like we spoke about in episode 1, this person was brutally murdering people, but also abducting children and sexually assaulting young children and leaving them alive. It was never notated or documented in criminal history. This was the first of its kind. Just like we mentioned in episode 1, Gil was a laughingstock. People thought he was nuts. He had one woman on his side, and remember that, because she's going to be important here in a minute. We got to talk about the weapons. There's no specific weapon. There's guns, there's knives, there's blunt force trauma, there's, you know, strangulation by hand, and then there's strangulation by objects. There was no specific thing. The only thing that was a reoccurring theme was this footprint. That shoe print would be a big topic in episode 2. Basically throughout the documentary, which this is in basically every documentary, they bring forward people who have had interactions with these people. And this is a couple who both survived. And it starts out, the wife is talking, and again, guys, we are in summer of 1985 here. The wife is talking, and she says that she's woke up by noise. And she was aggravated at first. She thought it was her husband. And she was really aggravated because she didn't want him to wake the kids up. So she's, you know, just kind of yells out, "John," like, you know, how you would to your husband or your significant other if they woke you up in the middle of the night and you didn't want your kids to wake up. That's how she was. She was like, "John," like the fuck? You're going to wake up the kids, you dumbass, you know? And she said immediately after she said John, she knew it wasn't John. She knew that it wasn't John. And she said, you know, they're asking her, you know, explain how you felt in that moment. Explain what was going through your mind. And she was like, "I can't." She said it was just like, she was like, "I didn't know if there was something in the home, on its way in the home, or had just left the home. But I knew something was here, and I was scared out of my mind." She said, "All I knew was fear, was just fear." Then it kind of goes over to her husband, okay? And he said, you know, when she first started to yell at him, he was like, you know, "Shit, I gotta be up in a couple hours." That's what was going through his mind, like, "Leave me alone, lady. I'm trying to sleep." And she continued to say, "No, like, there's something in here. There's someone in the house. I don't know, but there's something in here. You have to go check." And so he, you know, is finally like, okay, whatever. And she's like, you need to call the police. And he was like, what are you talking about? I am the police. So he was an officer for LAPD. And so, you know, they call the police, whatever. He checks the house, nobody's there. But she goes into the dining room and realizes that a window that they have never, ever, ever opened, because the window was painted shut. So, you know, like with a lot of older houses, some of the windows won't even open because they're like painted, like sealed shut. That was this case. She said they had never even tried to open it because it was painted shut. It was wide, like all the way up. John, her husband, had went out to the yard and they had watered their flower bed that night and like drenched it. So it was like saturated with water. And he notices a shoe print. And because the water was so moist from them watering their lawn, when he went to like raise up that window, which was really difficult to do because it was painted shut, he put so much force down on the ground that it made like a perfect shoe print. So John, being a police officer, an extremely smart rookie police officer, ran inside, grabs the shoebox, puts it over the shoe print, and waits for Gil to get there. And Gil was working night shift at the time. So he went straight over there and to see what was going on. And Gil even mentions in this part, you know, that was a really, really smart thing for John to do because he, you know, conserved that shoe print. And at this time, that was very important and vital information because they had nothing else at this point. At this point, all they knew was the shoe print and the AC/DC hat. That was it. They're Caucasian or a very light-skinned Hispanic. They knew he had dark hair, they knew he had messed up teeth, and they knew he had body odor. That's what they were working with at this point. That was it. Frank and Gil are like, they're like, okay, this is a reoccurring thing of his. He has this shoe. The weapons may be different. There may not be a specific target or a specific area of town, which that will get even worse here soon. Stay tuned. But there's this shoe. This shoe. He wears the same shoe over and over and over. So, and also John and his wife at the house I was just telling you guys about, they didn't see him. So apparently her voice being awake, that wasn't his way he liked to be attacked. He didn't like to attack that way. He liked for you to be asleep. He liked for you to be very vulnerable and have no way to defend yourself. That is a reoccurring theme here. Gil's like, okay, look, I'm gonna put my best guy on it. And he has one of their like forensic analysts who basically test evidence. He's like in evidence. They have him like, Gil's like, I wanna know this shoe. I want to know everything about this shoe. So this guy like gets the shit done, sis. He not only figures out what shoe it is, but he flies to, it was an Avia shoe. He flies to the guy who made these shoes and was like, what shoe is this? Finds out what shoe it is and finds out that only one black pair, they find out that it was black just based off of the witnesses and what they remembered, the kids and the one Maria Hernandez, what she had given. They knew that it was a black shoe. So after looking through all the records, the sales records that Avia gave the detectives, they now know that only one single black pair of Avias was sent to LA. Only one. And that is as far as they were able to find out. So they weren't able to find out anything past that. But they knew that there was only one pair. And this motherfucker was wearing them. And another thing that they mention in this episode is how LA is divided. It's divided up in like little small districts, okay? And it just makes it easier because LA is a very highly populated area and is also very heavy in crime. So it's very broken up. And it's very competitive in those districts. So officers don't like to share information. That will be important also later. So they start watching the news and getting all these things together because they're wanting to know, are there other murders happening out of our jurisdiction? Because we need to find out. And they find one. And this is one that I was shooketh. I was shook to the goddamn core. This was Mabel Bell and Florence Lang. This was two sisters who lived together, okay? Both of which were in their 80s. 80s. One of them, they were robbed. You know, he was big on the robbery. And one of them was just beaten all the way till her death. And the other sister, in her 80s, was not only beaten, but was also sexually assaulted by the Night Stalker. In their 80s, and this is when they would start showing like more people from around, you know, in LA, like freaking out, because this just proves even more, like it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what age you are. It doesn't matter what gender you are. It doesn't matter, you know, what your race is. It doesn't matter what class you are. Doesn't matter, nothing. Literally nothing. There was no target. And they mentioned in this episode, the only similarity was his dissimilarity. Mabel Bell, the one who had the blunt force trauma, she passed away. The other sister who was beaten and sexually assaulted, she actually managed to live. And y'all, they were in their 80s. While they're gathering evidence at the sister's house, they notice there's an alarm clock on the floor. And the cord is pulled out because he used the cords to tie up Florence, the one who would barely survive. And they see that there's a shoe print. So basically he put the alarm down in the floor, put his foot on it and yanked the cord out. And that's what he used to tie them up. So here we are again with the shoe print. And this is how we know that this murder in another district ties in to the rest that Gil and Frank already have tallied up. Not only was this extremely brutal and grotesque, but this is where you really find out how cruel the Night Stalker was. He then took his ass into the kitchen, prepared himself a meal, and ate it. Like, they show in the documentary like where he sat and where he hung out and like ate after he committed these heinous crimes. And mind you, Florence managed to survive until the next day when they were discovered by a gardener. Also very important in this episode is where you start to see they seen the pentagram on the wall. I'll have a picture of it. Basically a satanic marking. And guys, this was not very long after the whole Manson situation. So they were wondering now, was this someone who followed after Manson, or was this someone who was just like a wannabe Manson, was in lipstick above the bed where all of this had taken place? Also, after examination of one of the victims, they find that the pentagram is also on her leg as well, like towards her inner thigh as well. Okay, so the next part, y'all. This shit is so frustrating. I hate when there's parts like this in documentaries. But there's an attempted kidnapping, okay? Orange Toyota, okay? A girl is attempted to be kidnapped. She fights him off. She plays no games. Fights him off. He runs, gets in the car, leaves, whatever. He makes a traffic violation and is pulled over by a motorcycle cop. Why could there not been an actual officer in the car at this point? Whatever. He's pulled over by a motorcycle cop. The officer's checking him for weapons and all of these things, has him put his hands, does not cuff him, nothing. He has no backup. He is a police motorcyclist. Has him stand there on the car, put his hands up on the car, whatever. Walks back over to his motorcycle to get a citation. And over the police officer's intercom, they hear about this attempted kidnapping and they're describing his car. All of a sudden, he beats feet, runs away. When the officer walks over to the car, he realizes that he drew none other than a pentagram on the windshield and ran. Now, remember earlier I told you guys about the different jurisdictions in the area and how important that's going to be to remember throughout. Well, here's another case. Because where this happened, and this happened with like the city, it was taken to their lot, okay? Well, as soon as Gil and Frank find out about this, they're like, hey, we need that car checked for prints. Like, this is important. This is dire. They don't actually tell until later in the documentary, but we're gonna have to go ahead and close this up here because we have so much to discuss. They basically play a cat and mouse game with them back and forth. Like, Gil and Frank both are like calling them and like, what the fuck? Like, we need these prints, like the hell. Like, we're trying to save other lives here. Like, someone else could die. We have these prints. Maybe they won't. Like, we need them. They continuously are going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth until finally Gil's like, fuck this. And Frank is too. So they go to the chief and they're like, look, we need these prints and they're fucking around with us. Well, they try to fuck off the chief and the chief is not having it. He's like, absolutely not. I need these prints. So they give Gil and Frank access to come down to the lot. Bitch, they've been keeping it outside. Bitch, they've been keeping it outside for weeks. Rain, hot ass Southern California weather. It's no good. It's literally no good. But there is something that would be good in the floorboard of this car. What also is important to remember about this car, guys, is this car was stolen. That's going to be another like reoccurring theme here, so it's important to remember that. Now, this is an important part in this episode because this is where Gil and Frank start to get a little bit more personal, and they really start to explain what a case like this does to you mentally and physically. And, you know, Frank makes a statement like, some detectives, they go for the bottle and you just hope that they don't go too deep. And they start to talk about, Gil starts to talk about, you know, how he had, you know, his wife and his 3 kids. And they start to talk about how, you know, Gil talks about how his whole mood started to change. He started to be really snappy with his wife. They had no days off. They were working all the time, like 20 plus hours a day. And it was nonstop, as you know. And Gil talks about this one in particular day, how he had went home for lunch and he told his wife, you know, I'm going to lay down, I'm going to take me a nap. And she expresses how worried she is for his health. She's like, I think you just need to catch up on some sleep. You know, you might do yourself good to just take yourself like a rest, like just rest for a little bit. And he snaps at her and he says, look, if you don't wake me up at 12 o'clock, I'm going to call the office and I'll have the office wake me up at 12 o'clock. Like, I need to get up. This has to be done. Like, there is no way around it. And so as soon as he takes his shoes off, she said she remembers his pager going off. Boom. And this is just like a reoccurring theme. Like, it's important to remember this, to remember and think about like where you would be mentally if like you had no time, like all your time is completely contained by this shit. One night, Gil is asleep. He's home alone. His family's not there. He's asleep. He's in the bed. He wakes up at 3:30 in the morning, like with the feeling like he's here. He's in my house. So he gets up, he gets his gun, he's clearing out the home, like every single corner, keeping his back up against the wall, going through the whole house, like really trying to clear the house. And he completely clears it. There's nobody there. So just to kind of like regroup, he sits down, gets the TV on. It's complete dead silence, all but the TV. All of a sudden, the phone rings. That scared the absolute shit out of him, which I can only imagine. You know, you wake up thinking someone's in the house and there's nobody there, and then all of a sudden your phone rings. So he picks up the phone and guess what? They say, hey, you need to call your friend Linda Arthur. Now, remember the girl who was the only one back in the first episode who believed Gil and said, hey, I believe you that these two are tied together? That's who Linda was. So he calls her. He's like, hey, what's going on? So she starts to explain what she was doing that night, okay? She had some friends over. They were having them a nice little night, drinking in the jacuzzi that she had in her backyard. They stay out until like 3 in the morning. Okay, they finally end up winding down and going to bed. Her friends stay over and they sleep in her guest room. She said no more than she got laid down. One of her friends comes in and says, "Hey, Linda, there's a lady calling you." And she said, "What do you mean there's somebody calling me? There ain't nobody calling me. My phone's right here." And she said, "No, there's a lady out here calling you." She goes to say, like, what the hell is going on? And it's her neighbor, literally her neighbor. And she said from her window, she could see her neighbor's, like, bedroom window. And she's standing at the window and she says, Linda, I need you to call 911. I have been robbed and I have been sexually assaulted. She's been sexually assaulted and left alive. And as soon as I seen this in the documentary, this is going to be a little bit of a my thoughts part. I thought, well, there's going to be somebody's been murdered, because the only time that he leaves someone sexually assaulted is when he's already committed a crime. With Linda's neighbor, it was the same type of ordeal. He came in through the kitty door. She was asleep in bed. And mind you, Linda is across the street in a hot tub with her friends. Now, this right here is where you really have to, this is where you really come to terms with like what he was all about when he committed these crimes. You had to be vulnerable. It couldn't be you were having a good time with your friends in a hot tub and were all alert and awake and knew what was going on. No, you had to be asleep or you had to be a child. Like that was his motto. Like that was his thing. And I could only imagine being Linda from that point forward, like being right across the street from where one of these attacks happened. I couldn't imagine like wondering like, is he gonna come back? Is he gonna come back? Am I safe? Joyce Nelson, Monterey Park, middle of the night. This is a grandmother in her 60s who is murdered on July 7th again in like the wee hours of the morning, basically the middle of the night. And y'all, this one is one of the murders where the family of the victims speak. And they start out with her granddaughter. And I felt this because I was so close to my grandmother, my nanny, and you can tell that she had that relationship as well. And she talks about how she remembers it just like it was yesterday. She remembers the whole thing, how it all happened. And she remembers seeing her grandmother on TV and how they called her a grandmother. And she remembers just thinking in her head like how she was just so much more than that. She was so much more than just a grandmother. She was also a single mother for many years and lived completely alone. And she would be the one who put up the fight. Her granddaughter says, you know, it makes her feel a little better knowing that she was her spunky self, because she was known for that. She was very petite, like no more than 100 pounds, very short, petite lady. And she was in her 60s. And she put up a fight. She wasn't taking it. She was not going to be sexually assaulted. And while she was very brutally murdered, she was not sexually assaulted. So this is where they tie the two together, thanks to the news. So the news is what would bring these together. And they would then put two and two together that, oh, well, his sexual part was not fulfilled with Joyce. That's why he then went over to the neighbor of Linda's and sexually assaulted her. And this is also a part where they say with Linda's neighbor, they then inform you that he didn't want her to look at him. He kept saying, "Don't look at me, bitch. Don't look at me, bitch." And I think it's because he was trying to think, oh, well, I'm really at the last place, but I'm here, like these sick, twisted things. And that's what the detectives would start to like put two and two and three and four together. You know, they start like I said in part one, you have to think of it as a puzzle. And every single piece, you get closer and closer and closer and closer. So after all of this happened, this is when the media circus began. the media really started to get involved. They really started to be a little shysty as well. And we'll talk about that here soon. They really started to play their chips and let them fall where they may. They, really started to dig, really started to talk to other officers and smaller detectives and officers to find out what was going on. And they started interviewing all kinds of people from around the area, wanting to know, are you scared? This is what's going on. Da 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 da. The circus began. This was a full-on media frenzy. It was on every station, all hours of the day, all hours of the night. It was everywhere. It was all over the place. And while there might not have been internet back then, there was TV. And that was like the thing to do in the evening times with your family, was to sit around and watch TV. There's only so many stations you can watch back in the early 80s. So they couldn't hide it. These kids were finding out what really happened to their family, their grandmothers, and all of this stuff. They were really finding out the true things that were going on because the news went stir crazy. Back in the day, they would have a phone number, and of course the news would share out this phone number that if you had any information to call these numbers and share it, let us know what you know. Frank thought at this point, he said, we're going to find out. There's going to be some information come in. Something's going to happen. Gil says that calls were coming in left and right. People were calling in from all over the state, all over the county, all over the city. And Gil and Frank made sure that every single little bitty teeny tiny lead, whether it made sense or not, was checked out. They wanted to make sure that this wasn't going to happen to anybody else. So they made sure that all of these smaller detectives were doing their job and going out and checking these little leads. They even mentioned how ex-wives of husbands were calling in saying, oh yeah, that's for sure my ex-husband. That's 1000% him. Can you imagine? Jesus, lady. One call comes through, and this is the part where I told you guys that the media, okay, this part bothered me really bad. And if you watch the documentary, I really want to know, did this part bother you? Did this really get you pissed off at this news anchor bitch? So a call comes through and they're like, hey, it's Laurel. She's works for the news, okay? And he's like, oh God, and call comes through. And she's like, hey, Frank, what's with this shoe print? What's with this Avia shoe print? Why haven't you released that to the news? What's going on with that? And he just sits there stunned for a minute, oh shit, how did this bitch find out about the damn shoe print? And she's like, I'm gonna run with it. I'm gonna run with it. I'm gonna run with this story. And he says, no, you're not. You're not running with this story. And so Frank puts her through to the chief. And Gil's like, what's going on? What's going on? And he said, it's Laurel from the news. And she's, saying that she knows about the Avia shoe and she's going to release it. And they talk about how, no, bitch, no, we can't have you running with that. And Gil and Frank start to panic because they know if she runs with this story, then the killer, they know that he's watching the news. They know. And they have to assume that he is. Because if he watches it and learns that, he's going to change the shoes that he's wearing. He's not going to wear the damn Avia shoes anymore. So they transfer the call over to the chief. And, he gets the call, and then he calls Frank and Gil into the office. And he says, look, you guys are going to leave. You're going to go through the grand entrance, and Laurel is going to have a interview with you two. And they're like, what? And he said, yes, she's going to have an exclusive interview with the two of you. And in return, she will not share the information of the Avia shoe. They were pissed. And they show clippings in the documentary of Gil and Frank getting this interview. And you can tell that they're pissed. Oh, they're pissed. They're pissed mad. They're like, you damn bitch. And she talks about in there, where that's her job. And that was really hard for me to understand. They're trying to save other lives and you're worried about a damn story on the news. They ask Frank straight up in the documentary, so who do you think told Laurel about the Avia shoe? And he says straight up, a detective did. This would be Gil's first like actual, case like this. And, he was working, like I said, 20 hours a day. So, and he knew that like his wife couldn't fully like understand or comprehend like the level of like what he was doing, like what was going on. He knew she didn't understand. And so him and Frank, they'd go to this bar in Chinatown, and when he describes this bar, it makes me, the only reason why I mention it in the breakdown is because it reminds me of like a movie, because he says that there was like this sliding like door, and the girl would like look through the door, and if she knew you, you could come in, but if not, not happening. And so they'd go there and have a couple of drinks. And this is where Gil would say, one night after work, they went there to just, talk shop and kind of debrief the day. And he goes home after going to the bar with Frank, and he gets in the bed, and his wife's like, long day? And he's like, yep. And she's like, you smell like booze. I can just like imagine that conversation, like if I was to have it with Chris, like, motherfucker, please, you smell like booze. Who the fuck are you trying to fool around here? Like, I can just like imagine it. And like I said, this is when Gil's like temper was starting to become a very short fuse with his wife, because he didn't feel like she understood. He didn't feel like, he felt like she didn't really know what he was going through. Gil's wife says something very interesting at this part of the documentary too. She says, you have to be very patient to be a police officer's wife, and I can only imagine. So remember, I told you guys that there was going to be something important with the car that they impounded and left outside like idiots. So when Gil and Frank go, because they think that they're going to look at a car like in storage, like it's supposed to be inside, they acted like, oh, we've got this, we'll take care of it for you. And they just put it outside, so it's completely ruined. That's why they were beating around the bush. So basically somebody dropped the ball there, Avi. They searched the car anyways. They're not going to completely let it be a waste of time. And they find this little plastic case. And inside of the plastic case, they see a business card to a dentist office in Chinatown. So they head straight over there. They get over there to the dentist office, and the guy's like, you literally just missed him by 2 days. So if the other jurisdiction would have gotten off their ass and been more concerned with this actual these murders and this crime and this criminal than they were, oh, who gets the claim and who does this and that, basically a pissing contest. If they would have been more concerned with that, then they would have been able to get to the dentist office and they would have caught him in time. But he had already been there. So Gil calls up one of his dentist friends, and because he gets the dental records from the doctor's office, the dentist office in Chinatown, and he shows them to his dentist friend, and it's like, sorry guys, Chris just came home. So he shows his dental friend the records, and it's like, we missed him, they didn't get back to us, da-da-da. His dentist friend looks at the x-ray of his mouth and says, oh, well, he'll be back, because that tooth right there is going to be causing him some major, major pain. So Gil's like, that's all I needed to know. So Gil gets 2 detectives who are like new, like rookies, down to the dentist office, and they have them sit there every single day. That was literally their job, to sit in the dentist office and wait. After so much time, the jurisdiction that they're in is like, oh, hey, wait a minute. We don't want to be paying these detectives to sit in the office all day. So instead, let's install this emergency button like we use at banks. And that way, whenever he comes in, the doctor or the receptionist can press this panic button, and that'll send detectives and 911 there. That'll alert them, oh, he's here, he's at the dentist. Do you all want to hear some fucking shit? The literal day that they pull these detectives from the dentist office Gil gets a call from the Chinatown dentist. He's like, hey, where were you today? Why didn't you come down here? Gil's like, what the fuck are you talking about? He's like, we pressed the panic button like 100 times and nobody ever showed up. He was in here today. The literal day that they pulled the detectives out of the dentist office and install that piece of shit button, it malfunctions, doesn't work. So also do keep in mind that the dental name that he used at the dentist was Richard Mena. The next story, I don't know, this one hit my heartstrings even more because, again, they have the granddaughter talk a lot in this one, and she was very close with her grandparents, and this again is going to show even more how this motherfucker didn't target any specific age, any specific race, any specific anything. Like, it did not matter. So this was a elderly man and woman, and of course they do go into depth with the family. They go into depth into each individual, and I always do recommend that you guys watch the documentary. I just can't go into that much detail because we would be here all day. But the man that would be murdered in this specific case of Max and Leela, Max reminded me a lot of my pappy. He looked a lot like him in the pictures that they showed and stood a lot like him. And with this story, guys, this one is just fucking, I couldn't imagine. I could not imagine. They were supposed to meet with their daughter for, like, I think it was like tea or lunch or something that day, like brunch. And she was running late, and she was trying to get a hold of them to tell them, like, hey, I'm going to be late, you know, but I'm coming. And they weren't answering the phones. So she said that she got like this gut-wrench feeling, like something was absolutely wrong. Something wasn't right. So she decides to call her husband, and with their daughter, they drive over to her parents' house, and she goes inside by herself. And of course, you got to remember, during this time, this is when all of these murders are going on. These are all pretty much consecutive. So everybody's terrified. There's nobody that's just like, you know, living life normal. So she had a really bad feeling, and so they head over to the home. And as soon as they get there, she notices that the door to the backyard, the pool yard, was open. And she said that would never be the case, that door would never be open. And so she walks back there. She sees that the back sliding door's open. She knew that was off. She goes into the house, and she finds her parents murdered in their bedroom. Of course, her daughter would hear her scream, and they had to sit her daughter down and tell her daughter that her grandparents had been murdered. I could not fucking imagine. This happened in Glendale, so this was another one, you know, outside the jurisdiction. So they got in touch with the Glendale Police Department, and Frank says that this one there were signs of struggle. Like, this one showed that, like, they tried. Like, they didn't go down without a fight either. Like, there was some struggle that had ensued here. And again, this is odd and untypical for the Night Stalker, because he is very much the type to only, you know, embark on someone who is in a vulnerable state. You know, you've got the girl who's driving alone, and you've got all of these people who are asleep. Husband asleep on the couch, wife asleep in the bedroom. It's all of these scenarios where they're in very vulnerable situations. This particular case as well, there was no shoe prints, but they were both shot with a .22, which was his signature gun of choice. Of course, he didn't always use the gun. There was also knives and blunt force trauma with other objects and different things like that. But when he used a gun, he used .22. With this .22, they're actually able to connect it to the Dale Okazaki case. I'm so sorry if I'm mispronouncing that. It connected this case to Dale because of the gun. With this one, he actually committed 2 crimes in one night. And as Gil and Frank are walking up to the second home, Frank looks over at Gil, and they're on the porch Haven't even walked in the house yet. And they're like, look at this. And there's another ABS shoe print. So that's how they know, okay, well, he went from there to here, or from here to there, one, because these are connected. And it was just like, y'all, it was back to back to back. It was non-stop. And I just want you guys to know that there may be way more than what I even mentioned in this breakdown, because we would, like I said, we would be here way too long. But it was continuous. It was back to back to back to back to back to back to back. Now, I do just want to mention, because Frank does, and he says that this is the case that showed everything. Because in this one, it had all of his MOs. It had the shoe print. It had the mail being executed, execution style. And it also had the 22. So this particular case had all of his MOs in it. Now, I do just want to say, because the female here, her composite drawing was spot on. I mean, in comparison to the others, like she remembered him. She completely stored a memory bank of what he looked like in her head. Because when they show the composite drawing in this part of the documentary, I was like, that is almost spot on. And this would also be the composite drawing that Frank and Gil decided to go public with. So this is the first time that the public are actually seeing a composite of the killer. So they decide to get a meeting together. Basically just trying to get everybody involved, you know, that's involved in this case in any way. Try to get everybody on the same goddamn page. And as soon as they sat down to start this meeting, the goddamn phone rings. And here they go again. Now, this was the Petersons. And when I heard this, I was like, you've got to be fucking kidding me. This motherfucker has now done this 3 separate times. He shoots them, he's trying to shoot them execution style, which you know he loved to do. And he hits the wife just beside her nostril, but it doesn't hit any like main arteries or anything like that. And then shoots the husband as well, hits him like by his ear, but it doesn't hit anything or kill him. And the husband chases him out of the home, like starts to chase him. Can you imagine? Can you even imagine that shit? Like, you are half asleep, someone comes in your home, shoots at you and your wife, you both manage to survive, and then you chase him out of the house. Frank lets you know a little bit of the killer's terminology. So different things that he would like to say to his victims. And again, there were only so many witnesses who had survived the hands of the Night Stalker, but they did have a little bit. And this is where you learn that he likes to call people bitches. And that was like one of his favorite terminologies. And he did say this to Mr. Peterson, who chased him out of the house. He called him a bitch. And I'm thinking, he's the furthest thing from a bitch. Like, motherfucker, you came in his house and shot at him and his wife, and he chased you up out of there, motherfucker. Like, the fuck? I think you're the bitch, you know? At the home of the Petersons, he used a 25 auto. So they hadn't seen him use this gun before. But after talking to them and, you know, finding out like what he looked like, of course they knew it was him. There was an unusual part here, and that is there was a red primer on the shell casing. So just keep that in mind, because that is how we're going to be able to tie others into all of this. They know that from the moment that, remember in episode 1, the husband was able to call 911 before he passed. They know that he was at least reading the papers, because from that moment forward, he would take the phones with him. Like they were disabled, they were broken, or taken altogether from that moment forward. So they at least knew that he was watching the news or reading the paper. They knew that much, because that was released to the newspapers, and they released it out that, you know, the husband had called and all this. Frank ends up getting a little irritated. He ends up losing his cool a little bit. And so he snaps basically on the killer to the media. And he said from that moment forward, that is the only time in his detective history that he's ever slept with a gun. But he was sleeping with a gun from like that point forward, because he knew that if he was watching the news and he seen that, that probably pissed him off, because he said some things. We'll just put it that way. He called them, you know, a lot of things. He said some things. Just watch the documentary. If you haven't already, you should have already. If they start like sharing like different people who have spoke media, so they're showing like different news clippings, asking all of the people from around the area, like, are you going to buy a gun? Do you have intentions to buy a gun? And there's like little old ladies in there like, damn right. Period, poo. I'm buying a gun. Fuck. Like, they're all like,
I don't understand why somebody can't identify him. He has to live somewhere. Somebody must know. He's a weird looking character.
This is where the name comes in. Journalists wanted him to have a name. They wanted to be able to call him something. And they went through a couple, but the one that stuck was the Night Stalker. That's the one that stuck. And you will find out how it stuck, and it's actually because the killer chose it. So Frank and Gil get a call to go to Diamond Bar, and Gil literally lived 5 minutes from there. When Diamond Bar happened, this is when Gil's wife panicked, because again, they had kids and she was panicked. She was like, this is too close to home. I'm out of here. I'm out of here, and I'll come back home when all this is over, but we're leaving. And this was Gil's career. This was his job. So he understood he wanted his kids and wife to feel safe. So this is when they would end up leaving the house. So they get there to the crime scene. He entered through the back entry door, and Frank says a telltale sign. There's a half-eaten melon on the counter. So Frank's already like, it's him. In this home, again, there is a deceased husband, and he's been shot in the temple. It's a .25 semi-automatic pistol, just like with the last home. The red primer that they've seen at the Petersons, that was also at this home as well. So the woman at this home, she had been sexually assaulted, and she tells police that he continued to tell her, don't look at me. Don't look at me, bitch. Don't look at me. And she says, I swear to God, I won't look at you. And he says, swear to Satan, you won't look at me. And she says, I swear to Satan, I won't look at you. Like, what the fuck? So Gil starts to realize that, you know, media is going to get information one way or another. Because there's going to be detectives who are jealous. There's going to be detectives who are bored. There's going to be detectives who are paid off. So Gil decides, you know what, instead of all this bullshit and these rumors, people saying that he's not dangerous and all of this, let's just record 25 tapes, send them out to all the news outlets, and get the real, true information out there. And so that's what they did. Gil was the one to be on the tapes. He gives out all the information that they were ready to give at that time and sends it out to the media. And that's what people would first learn about the Night Stalker. Soon as that tape's relieved, boom, we go to San Francisco. And this is where there's going to be another one. You're going to hear people in San Francisco start to talk about the murder that happened down there. Like, this is when the crimes would start to spread. It would go from San Francisco, and then the mayor in San Francisco decides to release information out to the press about the shoe. She releases all of this shit. People, are you joking me? Are you joking me? She releases all of this information. Like, it's just insane. Now, when it comes to connecting the dots of it being the same person, the news anchors would also be ones to realize and connect the dots. So literally on the same flight that Gil and Frank were on to fly to San Francisco, also was, you know, the news reporters that are all throughout the documentary as well. And so at this point, the news reporters are like, oh yeah, we're in the right spot. We're where we're supposed to be. And this is when Gil and Frank were like, fuck this bitch, you know? Also, the mayor in San Francisco, she also took it upon herself to release the information of pentagrams. And when this information was released, because this had been denied to Laurel, the news anchor, by Frank already, because she walked up to him and another detective had told her that worked in San Francisco, was like, oh yeah, there's shit on the walls and da-da-da-da. People started to really panic and started to call in and say, oh, well, there was writing pentagrams here and pentagrams there. And people started to go stir crazy, because you got to remember that this is like, I don't know, 10 years after Manson. So people were really starting to think, is this someone who follows Manson? People were starting to really fucking panic, really. Laurel says at that point, you know, it just continues to get creepier and creepier and creepier as you go along. Just every step further into the case that you would take, you would get more and more and more and more and more and more creeped out. When the mayor releases this information, because I kind of skipped ahead, because guys, this is super long, okay? We're looking, I have so much to go through here. But when this information is released, Gil and Frank are both like, they're on their last leg here. They're like done, because they feel like all the hard work and everything, that's been put into this shit has now just went to nothing, because Gil and Frank were both sure that the Night Stalker was watching the news. So they see the chief at a bar, and they tell the chief, and the chief is like, all right, well, I'll talk to you guys later. You know, maybe an hour goes by, and the chief calls them and says, hey, get you something to eat, sober up, meet me at the station in an hour. And they go to the station, and the chief gets on in front of all of the news. He invites all the news reporters from the area, and he talks about how imperative it is that this information stay low key, because if it's continued to be broadcasted all over the place, then it's going to get harder and harder and harder to catch this man. And, you know, that really helped Gil and Frank like get back into business, because they had kind of lost their umph there, because they were like, you know, what the fuck? So then we have a boyfriend and girlfriend. The girlfriend is shot as well, but she survives. The boyfriend ends up getting put in the hospital. Of course, she was sexually assaulted and all of his typical bullshit. Of course, Frank knew. He said, oh, he'll do it again. He'll be back up here. He'll be back up here and he'll do it again. And of course, Frank was right. During all this, okay, and again, guys, I am having to cut out some stuff because this is becoming really long, but I want you guys to know the important information to catching the Night Stalker, because that is the name of this documentary, The Hunt, right? So there is actually a guy out in his driveway working on a bicycle, and he sees the car pull up. Oh yes, he sees this station wagon pull up with partial plates, and he calls in. He's like, hey, I seen that car. It pulled up, was in, and left. One good thing that did happen was they were able to spot the car. And they were able to they were hoping that, of course, he would come back to the car. Of course, that didn't happen. He had ditched it. But what they were able to do was they were able to pull a fingerprint off of the rearview mirror where he had kind of alternated it, because it was, again, another stolen car, of course. They were able to get a fingerprint from where he moved it. However, back then, you had to have comparison fingerprints. So they didn't have anything to compare it to. So they were at a standstill, but they had a fingerprint. So if he fucked up and he left his fingerprint, then he fucked up, because they had that shit. So they end up getting a call from a female, and she says, hey, my dad, he, you know, works down at the train depot, the bus stop off Skid Row, and he's befriended someone. And this guy admitted that he is the Night Stalker. He admitted to a killing. They're like, oh, really? And they also find out that he goes by the name Rick. So they send detectives out there to Skid Row to locate the father. They find him, and he eventually does admit, yes, I know him, and he's from El Paso. So then he says, you know, Rick had given me a pistol, a .22, because he gave it to me to get rid of. And I took it to Tijuana and give it to somebody. Well, Frank's like, all right, let's head to Tijuana. So they do. They head to Tijuana. They not only get the gun, bitch, but they also get a boom box that was the sisters. Remember the elderly sister in their 80s? It was one that was stolen from their home that their grandson had gifted, or nephew or something had gifted to them, and he actually still had the serial number. So he was able to prove that that was the one that he got. And they were like, oh shit, this is our fucking guy. This is the fucking guy. Going back to San Francisco police, they get one of their informants comes in and surrenders a bracelet. And he says, hey, I think this is linked to the your Night Stalker case. And the informant says, hey, I got this from my wife's mother, and she lives in San Pablo, California, I believe. So that morning, they head to the mother's house. They get there, and she says, hey, I got it from my boyfriend. And she tells them, gives up this information. Oh, well, he got it from his friend from El Paso. His name's Rick. Like, what the fuck? She's just like, yeah, he got it from his friend Rick, you know, he's from El Paso. He then continues to say, oh yeah, and by the way, Rick likes to wear a black AC/DC hat. He loves his members only, you know, yeah, that's Rick. He's got bad teeth, all of this. And the more that she continued to speak, the more that this officer in San Francisco is like, this is our guy. She knows our fucking guy. We need to talk to the boyfriend. We need to talk to the boyfriend. So they get with the boyfriend, and he's trying to play hardball. And he's like, I don't know his last name. I don't know. And he starts to talk like shit with the officers in San Francisco. And this officer from San Francisco in the documentary, he's not having that shit. So they kind of go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And as soon as he reared back like he was going to hit him, the boyfriend was like, Richard Ramirez. And they're like, gotcha, bitch. That would be the end of episode number 3. Okay, guys, I hope you guys did enjoy part 2 to the Night Stalker. Do not forget to have your notifications cut on, because next week we do not only have the last part and my final thoughts to the Night Stalker, but we also have a huge announcement, and I cannot wait for you guys to find out. I also have a collab coming this Sunday. It will be like, you watch my video and then I'll send you to the collab person's video. Because of COVID, we can't actually get together in person, or we do not want to. And we'll talk more about that in the collab video this Sunday. But do be sure that you do subscribe and have your notifications cut on before you leave, so that you are able to have all that information. Also, be sure to go down below in the description box and follow me on social media. Every platform that I'm active on is linked down below. Be sure that you do like this video and share it with your friends on all other platforms. And until next time, my darlings.